All right, so you wanted more on this Pete Hegseth thing, right? His confirmation as Secretary of Defense.
Yeah.
It's been pretty dramatic. We've got excerpts from his DOD bio, reads like a total highlight reel. And we've got this news piece from Public TV English. They're digging into the Senate vote and all the craziness around it. So let's see what's really going on, like beyond just the headlines and what it could all mean for the future of the military.
Yeah, it's a wild story for sure. Definitely some twists and turns.
No kidding. So first off, who is this guy? I mean, his bio makes him sound like some kind of action hero. Commissioned officer, served in Guantanamo, Iraq, Afghanistan.
Oh, and there's more. 2 Bronze Stars, combat infantryman badge.
Yeah.
Even an expert infantryman badge. They don't just give those out for showing up.
Yeah, 2 Bronze Stars. I mean, that's got to be a big deal, right?
Yeah, it really is. I mean, a Bronze Star, that usually means acts of heroism or exceptionally meritorious service, often under fire. And the combat infantryman badge, that one's even more specific. It means he was actually in ground combat. To get those awards, you have to meet some incredibly tough standards. Show courage, leadership, the whole thing. And under pressure.
Okay, so we're not just talking about some resume padding here. These are serious credentials. But then you get in the confirmation vote, and things get really interesting. A 51-50 split, with VP J.D. Vance casting the deciding vote. That can't be very common, can it?
Incredibly rare. It's only the second time in history that's happened. For a cabinet nominee, I mean. So just that alone tells you how controversial Hegseth was, even before you got the job. I mean, it suggests that people were really divided about whether he was right for the position. And it kind of foreshadows all the challenges he's likely to face, trying to actually get things done.
Yeah, and controversial might be an understatement. This Public TV English article, they list some pretty serious accusations. Allegations of sexual assault, rumors about alcohol abuse, even claims of financial mismanagement, with veterans' charities, no less.
Right, and it's important to note, Hegseth has denied all of these allegations. But the fact that they were out there, being talked about during the confirmation, it definitely added to the tension. It makes you wonder about his judgment and his character and how that might impact his leadership. And you know how the public sees the military.
Yeah, it wasn't just whispers either. You had opposition from both sides. McConnell, Murkowski, even Susan Collins voted against him. Murkowski even said that Hegseth didn't have the strength of character to lead the DOD.
You rarely see that kind of pushback for a cabinet appointment, especially for a job like this. Defense secretary, I mean, it suggests that these concerns about his character, they were serious, and they could really get in the way of his ability to lead, to build consensus and all that.
So for the Trump administration, though, this has got to feel like a huge win, right? They backed him all the way, despite all the controversy.
Well, it's definitely a victory for Trump, no question. And it shows he still has a lot of clout within the party. But it also raises some questions about Trump's judgment. Maybe he's putting loyalty ahead of other qualifications. And then you have Schumer on the other side, calling Hegseth erratic, unqualified, and unfit, which shows you just how deep this partisan divide runs. With that kind of polarization, it's going to be really tough to get anything done on defense, issues that need bipartisan support.
So trying to see the bigger picture here, what does this appointment really tell us?
Well, it could mean a real shift in priorities for U.S. defense, maybe moving away from the traditional approaches and making some big changes to the military structure and culture. It's a move that clearly energized Trump's base. But it also has people worried about more partisanship in the military and how that might affect morale, readiness, even how the world sees us.
And part of that shift seems to be this idea of getting rid of woke policies. That's what he calls them anyway. And restoring this warrior culture at the Pentagon. That's kind of his big thing.
Yeah, and it's really important to understand what he means by those terms. Woke policies. To him, that probably includes things like diversity and inclusion initiatives, sensitivity training, and those policies about transgender service members, things he's been very opposed to in the past.
So you want some more traditional military?
Yeah, you could say that. Maybe even a more aggressive approach. Less focus on things like diversity and more on pushing those physical limits, combat skills, that sort of thing. He's talked about streamlining things too, getting rid of what he sees as unnecessary bureaucracy. He thinks it slows the military down, makes it harder to make decisions quickly.
Okay, but streamlining bureaucracy sounds good in theory. But how do you actually DO that? I mean, the DOD is massive.
Well, think of it like this giant machine with 1 million moving parts. That's the DOD. And Hegseth wants to make it run better, maybe cut down on paperwork, simplify the chain of command, maybe even make the whole department smaller. But the question is, can you actually do that, streamline a system that complex without messing things up? His critics worry that making big changes like that could disrupt important operations and destabilize the military.
And what about the people actually serving? The troops on the ground, how are they going to feel about all this? Will they think it's a good thing? Or will it just lead to more division and uncertainty?
That's a really important point. Anytime you have a major cultural shift, especially in an organization as big and complicated as the military, you're going to have some friction. There's a risk. That Hegseth's vision could actually alienate some service members, particularly those who think it's important to have a more diverse and inclusive military. And that could lead to lower morale, people leaving the service, maybe even trouble recruiting new people.
And then there's how all this looks to the rest of the world. The U.S. military. It plays a huge role globally. So if other countries start to think that we're becoming more aggressive, less interested in diplomacy, how's that going to affect our relationships?
That's a big question. Will Hegseth's approach mean a more America first kind of policy?
You're more isolationist?
Or will the U.S. keep working with other countries on things like peacekeeping? I mean, he said things in the past that suggest he's not a big fan of multilateralism, you know, working with lots of different countries. He seems to prefer unilateral action, which could mean less emphasis on diplomacy and a more militaristic foreign policy. And that could create tension with our allies and our enemies.
So there are a lot of potential consequences here, both here in the U.S. and internationally. It feels like Hegseth's confirmation has really opened up a can of worms. It's hard to say what's going to happen.
Absolutely. The stakes are incredibly high. We're talking about the future direction of the military, its role in the world, and ultimately the safety and security of the country. It's a story that's only just beginning.
It feels like we're watching this clash of ideologies. And it's not just some abstract political thing. This directly affects the lives of the people in the military, their training, their deployments, the whole culture they operate in.
That's exactly right. It's not just some theoretical debate. It has real consequences for people's lives.
Yeah.
Which is why it's so important to understand what Hegseth actually means when he talks about this warrior culture. What does that look like in practice?
Yeah, it does seem kind of vague. I mean, obviously everyone wants a strong military. Yeah. But what is he actually talking about changing?
Well, he said that he thinks the military has become too focused on political correctness, social justice, all that. He sees that stuff as undermining combat readiness. But his critics argue that having a diverse and inclusive military actually makes it stronger, more effective.
Yeah.
Because you're drawing on a wider range of talent and perspectives.
So he's basically saying, we need to go back to a tougher approach. Less diversity, more like pushing physical limits and combat skills.
Well, it's not quite that simple, but he has said that he wants to go back to more traditional training with a bigger emphasis on physical and mental toughness and wants to streamline things, get rid of what he sees as unnecessary bureaucracy. He thinks that stuff holds the military back, makes it harder to act decisively.
Okay, but streamlining bureaucracy sounds good in theory, but how do you actually DO that? I mean, the DOD is massive.
Think of it this way. The DOD is like a giant machine with a ton of moving parts. Hegseth wants to make it run more efficiently, maybe by cutting down on administrative tasks, simplifying the chain of command, maybe even shrinking the department itself. But the question is, can you streamline something that complex without causing unintended consequences, breaking things? His critics worry that making such drastic changes could disrupt critical operations and undermine the stability of the military.
And what about the impact on the people serving? How will these changes be received by the troops on the ground? Will they feel empowered? Or will it just lead to more division and uncertainty?
That's a key concern. Anytime you have a major cultural shift in an organization, especially one as large and complex as the military, you're bound to have some friction. There's a real risk that Hegseth's vision could alienate some service members, particularly those who value the progress that's been made in areas like diversity and inclusion. And that could lead to lower morale, decreased retention rates, maybe even difficulty attracting new recruits.
And let's not forget the global impact. I mean, the U.S. military plays a huge role on the world stage. So if there's a perception that we're shifting towards a more aggressive, less diplomatic approach, how will that affect our relationships with other countries?
That's a crucial piece of the puzzle. Will Hegseth's vision lead to a more isolationist America First approach? Or will the U.S. continue to engage in international coalitions and peacekeeping efforts? His past statements suggest he's pretty skeptical of multilateralism, working with lots of different countries. He seems to prefer unilateral action, which could signal a shift away from diplomacy towards a more militaristic foreign policy. And that could create tension with both allies and adversaries.
So there are a lot of potential consequences to consider. both domestically and internationally. It feels like Hegseth's confirmation has opened up a whole Pandora's box of possibilities, and it's hard to predict exactly how things will play out.
Absolutely. The stakes are incredibly high. We're talking about the future direction of the U.S. military, its role in global affairs, and
Yeah.
ultimately, the safety and security of the nation. It's a story that's only just beginning to unfold.
So we've talked about Hegseth's background and all the controversy around his confirmation and the potential impact of his vision for the DoD. But what about the man himself? Like, what makes him tick? What are his core beliefs?
To really understand Hegseth, we need to look beyond just his military service and political stuff. We need to get into his writing, his speeches, to see how he sees the world. And luckily, we have a great resource for that. His book, The War on Warriors.
Right, that New York Times bestseller he wrote back in 2024, he laid out his vision for the military in that. What's the central message there?
In The War on Warriors, Hegseth argues that the U.S. military has been weakened by what he calls liberal policies and political correctness. He thinks these policies have undermined the traditional warrior ethos and made it harder for the military to fight and win wars.
So he's saying the military's become too soft, too focused on social issues, and not focused enough on its core mission.
That's a pretty good summary. He wants a return to the fundamentals: strength, discipline, a willingness to sacrifice. The values he believes have been eroded in recent years.
But isn't there a danger in romanticizing the past? I mean, the world has changed a lot, and warfare's evolved. Can we really just go back to some idealized vision of what a warrior should be?
That's a good point. The challenge is finding that balance between preserving the core values of the military and adapting to the realities of the 21st century. I mean, the military needs to be ready to fight not only conventional wars, but also cyber warfare, terrorism, all sorts of unconventional threats. Hegseth's critics argue that his focus on traditional warfare could leave the military unprepared to handle these new challenges.
It seems like there's this tension between tradition and adapting to a rapidly changing world. And that's where things get tricky, because what one person sees is essential to military culture, another might see as outdated or even harmful.
Exactly. That's why this debate is so important. It's not just about Hegseth's personal vision for the DoD. It's about how we understand the military's role in the modern world and what values should guide it.
So if we had to sum up Hegseth's philosophy, what are the key takeaways? What are the driving principles behind his thinking?
I'd say the three pillars of his philosophy are strength, sacrifice, and service. He believes these are the fundamental values that define the warrior ethos, and he sees them as having been neglected in recent years.
Okay, let's break those down. What does he mean by strength?
For Hegseth, strength means both physical and mental toughness. It's about resilience, being able to withstand hardship, having the courage to face danger, the discipline to follow orders, even under extreme pressure.
And what about sacrifice?
He sees sacrifice as the willingness to put the needs of the mission and the country above your own desires. It's about accepting the risks that come with military service, including the ultimate sacrifice.
And lastly, service.
To Hegseth, service is more than just wearing a uniform or doing a job. It's about dedicating yourself to something bigger than yourself, to a cause that's greater than your own ambitions. It's about embodying duty, honor, patriotism.
So it sounds like he's advocating for a return to a more traditional view of the military, almost chivalrous.
There's definitely an element of that in his thinking. He sees the military as a calling, a way of life that demands commitment and selflessness, qualities that he feels have been lost. He argues that the military has become too bureaucratic, too focused on career advancement and personal comfort, and not enough on these core values of strength, sacrifice, and service.
But those values still exist in the military, right?
Yeah.
There have to be plenty of service members who embody those ideals.
Absolutely. There are countless examples of incredible bravery, dedication, and selflessness. But Hegseth's point is that these values aren't at the forefront anymore. They've been overshadowed by other priorities. He believes the emphasis on diversity and inclusion, while well-intentioned, has come at the expense of cultivating a warrior culture.
So he sees himself as a reformer, somebody who's going to shake things up and get the military back to what he sees as its true purpose.
Exactly. He's trying to reassert what he believes are the core values of the military, to reawaken that sense of calling and purpose.
But is it really that simple? Can you just flip a switch and change the culture of such a massive and complex institution?
Cultural change is never easy, especially in an organization as rooted in tradition as the military. It takes more than just orders from the top. You need buy-in from everyone, from the lowest-ranking soldiers to the top generals.
And it requires a shared understanding of what those values actually mean in practice. Because strength, sacrifice, and service, they can mean different things to different people.
That's right. And that's where the potential for conflict comes in. Hegseth's vision of those values might not align with everyone's understanding, and his attempts to enforce his vision could lead to more division within the military.
So we're back to that question of division. How will Hegseth's approach be received by the people actually serving? Will they embrace his vision or push back against it?
That's the big unknown. There's a risk that his focus on traditional values could alienate those who value the progress that's been made in areas like diversity and inclusion. That could lead to lower morale and people leaving the service. But on the other hand, his message of strength and purpose might resonate with some service members who feel like the military has lost its way.
And how will his leadership style affect morale and cohesion? I mean, he's a polarizing figure in politics. Will that carry over into the military?
That's a valid concern. His confrontational style and his tendency to see things in black and white could make existing divisions in the military even worse. His critics worry that he'll prioritize loyalty over competence and that he'll try to silence anyone who disagrees with him. That could make the military less effective and less able to adapt.
It seems like he's walking a tightrope. He needs to be strong and decisive, but also unifying and inclusive.
It's a tough balance to strike. Not many leaders can do it well. Hegseth's success or failure will depend on whether he can build consensus, inspire trust, and show that he understands what it takes to lead a modern military in a world that's changing all the time.
Okay, so we've talked about Hegseth's background, his controversial confirmation, his vision for the DoD, his core beliefs, and the potential impact of his leadership style. But there's one piece of the puzzle we haven't really talked about yet, his relationship with former President Donald Trump.
Yes, the Trump factor. You can't talk about Hegseth without talking about the role Trump played in his rise to power.
They're pretty close, right? Politically and personally.
Very close. Hegseth was one of Trump's earliest and most vocal supporters, and he's remained a loyal ally ever since. He was on Fox News all the time, defending Trump. And there was even talk of him getting a job in the Trump administration back in 2016.
And Trump was totally behind Hegseth's nomination for Secretary of Defense, even when it was clear he was facing a lot of opposition.
Absolutely. Trump saw Hegseth as someone who shared his views, someone who was willing to challenge the establishment and put his agenda into action. People saw Hegseth's nomination as a way for Trump to keep his influence over the military, even after leaving office.
So what does that tell us about Hegseth's priorities? Is he more concerned with being loyal to Trump than with doing what's best for the military?
That's a hard question to answer. It's clear that Hegseth is loyal to Trump, and that will probably influence his decisions. But he's also a complicated person with his own beliefs and ambitions.
But he's also a smart politician. He knows his position is shaky, that he needs to stay on Trump's good side.
That's true. And that creates a tricky situation where his loyalty to Trump could clash with what's needed to effectively lead the military. Hegseth will need to be careful to balance those competing pressures.
So it's a balancing act. Keep Trump happy,
Yeah.
but also show that he can lead the military in a way that benefits the whole country.
Exactly. And it won't be easy. Everyone's watching him, both his supporters and his critics, and any mistake could be a disaster.
So what can we expect from Hegseth's time as Secretary of Defense? Will he completely transform the military? Or will he just be a puppet for Trump?
It's too early to say how he'll handle all these challenges. But one thing's for sure, it's going to be fascinating to watch. And things could get pretty crazy.
It'll be interesting to see how he balances those competing pressures. Loyalty to Trump versus the needs of the military, traditional values versus the demands of a changing world.
He's got a lot on his plate, and the whole world is watching to see what he does.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground. Hegseth's background, his controversial confirmation, his vision for the DoD, his core beliefs, his relationship with Trump, and all the potential challenges he's facing. It's been a pretty deep dive.
Yeah, we've only scratched the surface. There's still a lot to unpack. So many unanswered questions.
But that's what makes this so interesting, right?
Yeah.
We're at the start of a new chapter in U.S. military history, and we have no idea how it's going to end.
It's a story with incredibly high stakes and uncertain outcomes. And it affects all of us. Whether we realize it or not, the decisions Hegseth makes will have a huge impact on Americans and on the future of our country.
So we can't just sit back and do nothing. We need to be paying attention to these issues, asking tough questions, holding our leaders accountable.
Exactly. And that's what this deep dive is all about. Encouraging you to think critically, to dig deeper, and come to your own conclusions.
So what stood out to you from all this? What questions does this raise for you about the future of the U.S. military?
What are your hopes and fears? What do you think Hegseth should focus on?
We encourage you to keep researching, reading, and talking about these issues.
Because the more informed we are as citizens, the better equipped we'll be to deal with the challenges of our world and to create the future we want.
This really does feel like a crossroads. Like his confirmation, it could be a major turning point for the U.S. military. If he can actually pull this off, his vision could have a huge impact, not just in the military, but on America's place in the world.
Oh yeah, it's a pivotal moment for sure. But the question is, will he succeed? And at what cost?
That's what I keep coming back to. Like, what does success even look like here? It's so complicated. Military readiness, morale, how other countries see us. How do you even measure the impact of these changes?
Yeah, success in this case is pretty subjective. It depends on your perspective and what you think is most important. Will he meet those goals he laid out, restoring the warrior culture and rolling back those woke policies? He might, but will that actually make the military stronger?
Yeah.
More effective? What about the unintended consequences? Those are the big unknowns right now.
Right, and that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating. We're at the edge of something huge, something that can totally change everything.
Yeah.
But we can't really see the full picture yet.
Yeah, it's like we're watching this play with all these different storylines happening at once. You've got clashing ideologies, this generational divide. It's almost a battle for the soul of the military. The outcome is uncertain. The stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah.
And the whole world's watching.
And that's where we come in, right? We'll keep digging into these issues, analyzing what happens next, trying to make sense of it all, and we'll keep you updated as this story unfolds.
So until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep thinking critically. The future of the U.S. military, and our own future, depends on it.
Well said. So that's our deep dives into Pete Hegseth's confirmation as Secretary of Defense.
Thanks for joining us as we explore this pivotal moment.